Well, welcome to Dr. Johnson's house. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you here again for a rather exciting lecture on Reynolds this time as part of the lunchtime series sponsored by the Fleet Street Quarter Business Improvement District. So lovely. I hope you've enjoyed some lunch today. So to today's talk then, I'm introducing Will Iron here. He is the Public Programmes Manager at the Royal Academy of Arts and is particularly interested in 18th century art, literature, culture and fashion. His background is in the Central St Martin's and the King's College Fashion and in British Fashion Council, where he's worked previously as well. Today he'll be looking at Reynolds and his depiction and use of dress as a way to attempt a timeless style, which I thought was interesting. And it brought to mind something Johnson said, if you'll indulge me reading. He said, in one of the Ramblers, which was written in this room, the most striking effect of riches is the splendour of dress, which every man has observed to enforce respect and facilitate receptions. So really not to be underplayed, the significance of fashion and what one's wearing and why. So without further ado, if you'll join me in welcoming Will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celine, and it's lovely to be here. And as Celine said, I'm currently working at the Royal Academy of Arts, where Joshua Reynolds, this great 18th century portraitist, was our very first president. The Royal Academy was set up by artists, it's run by artists, it still is to this day, and it's very much sort of has artists as its heart. And this year would have been Reynolds' 300th birthday. So we've been thinking quite a bit about Reynolds over the year, and there's quite a lot to explore when it comes to Reynolds. He was a really prolific painter, so we have a huge amount of paintings, particularly portraits, but lots of other pieces as well surviving that we can analyse. He also wrote a lot about art, so we've got a really good insight into what his views were on art and the art world of the 18th century. And he was also a great figure in London society. So he was a great networker, sort of was friends with or knew most of the leading lights in 18th century London at the time, not least, of course, Samuel Johnson. They were great friends, and he painted him a number of times. And we might touch on this later, perhaps, but there's a really interesting area of study when you look at the paintings that Reynolds wasn't commissioned by a particular sitter for, but ones that he painted for his own joy or his own light. So the first one he paints of Johnson is in this guise. Then you've also got the painting of Francis Barber, the enslaved Jamaican man who then became Johnson's heir, and there's the Northcote copy downstairs. And actually we've got the Reynolds painting coming to the Royal Academy in the new year as part of a new exhibition, Entangled Pasts, which we're very excited about. So do check that one out. And of course, another non-commissioned painting that Reynolds did was the great masterpiece of Mai, which has taken pride of place at the National Portrait Gallery's really recently refurbished galleries. Arguably the most famous portrait of Johnson that Reynolds did is the one that he did commissioned by Henry and Hester Thrale for their new extension at Streatham Park in 1773, and Reynolds was commissioned to paint both Johnson but also lots of friends of Reynolds himself, of Johnson's and of the Thrales, and we'll come back to those a bit later on. This talk is very much going to be thinking about Reynolds' quite complicated relationship to clothing. It's not going to be a potted history of 18th century dress. Firstly, we only have half an hour, but also if you want to find out what people actually wore in the 18th century, Reynolds is the last artist that you want to have a look at. And we'll see why that is very shortly. It's also not going to be chronological, so I'll jump around a little bit, but hopefully give you a bit of a sense of what Reynolds and a few of his contemporaries might have been thinking about when they were painting clothing. And finally, it is worth pointing out that we're very much looking at sort of an aristocratic, beau monde set of society. So this is not a full spectrum of 18th century society at the time. As the president of the newly founded Royal Academy, Reynolds had a lot of thoughts on art, and he really wasn't afraid to share them. So he gave a series of lectures at the Royal Academy that were aimed at the Royal Academicians and at the Royal Academy School's students. They became known as his discourses. They're, I think, still in print today, and they are at times quite heavy going, but there are some really highlights in there. So if you're interested, do check those out. And they're his views on what young artists should be painting and how they should paint them. This is from Discourse 7, so 1776. And here he outlines his theories of the 1770s on painting dress. And I'm going to read that out, the full passage here. He, therefore, who in his practice of portrait painting wishes to dignify his subject, which we will suppose to be a lady, will not paint her in the modern dress, the familiarity of which alone is sufficient to destroy all dignity. He takes care that his work shall correspond to those ideas and that imagination which he knows will regulate the judgment of others, and therefore dresses his figure something with the general air of the antique for the sake of dignity, and preserves something of the modern for the sake of likeness. By this conduct, his works correspond with those prejudices which we have in favour of what we continually see, and the relish of the antique simplicity corresponds with what we may call the more learned and scientific prejudice. Right, so in other words, what he's saying is that the portrait painter, if you have commissioned a portrait from a painter and he paints you in sort of the height of fashion, the idea is that the way things are going, by next year, it's already going to be out of date. So you paid all of this money for something that is then going to look old-fashioned. So instead, what Reynolds suggests for the artist is to sort of take a sort of quasi-classical, something that's sort of inspired by Greek or Roman sculpture, and create this sort of drapery aspect that he describes as a timeless style. On a side note, does anybody remember a few years ago when the artist Maggie Hambling was commissioned to create a sculpture of Mary Wollstonecraft, the great 19th century, the great 19th century feminist writer, and it's up in Newington Green, and it's this sculpture that was then unveiled, and there's huge uproar because the figure was naked. It was a female figure in the nude. And it's the same kind of question here. So Maggie Hambling didn't want to present, and it's not meant to be Mary Wollstonecraft, it's meant to be every woman, but she didn't want to put her in Victorian dress because Hambling's argument was that Wollstonecraft's writing is still relevant today, and she didn't want to put her in modern dress because, again, that sort of times it very much so. So it's the same kind of question here about how you're timing a sort of a timeless piece of art, and we can come back to that in the questions if we would like to. Right. So what does Reynolds' conception of timeless dress look like? He doesn't always abide by his own rules, and we'll come on to some of those exceptions later on, but some examples of what he is talking about. So this is Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and it's 1776, and by this point, she's already a celebrity. She is already a style icon. However, in this painting, she is not in the dress of the 1770s. She has these full sleeves, a sort of gathered overskirt here, and we can't really see what's going on with her clothing, and that's sort of the point to Reynolds. So elsewhere in his discourses, he says, "In the same manner as the historical painter never enters into the detail of colours, so neither does he debase his conceptions with minute attention to the discriminations of drapery. It is the inferior style that marks the variety of stuffs. With him, the clothing is never woolen, nor linen, nor silk, satin, or velvet. It is drapery, it is nothing more." Very clear that this idea of the sort of clothing should kind of be the sort of drapery element that isn't really the sort of highlight of the piece. She's also in a pastoral setting, so she's outside of fashionable London society. So in theory, due to the lack of interiors or specific dress, this could be a beautiful young woman here, she's sort of 18 or 19, of any period, yeah? Except, so in the previous passage, he does say, preserve something of the modern for the sake of likeness. And here we can date this to like within 6 months to a year, because the hairstyle is pure 1777. It's this sort of towering style that would have been thickened with powder and pomade, adorned with feathers. And it sort of immediately dates this painting. So this sort of timeless idea is slightly thrown off by the hairstyle. It's a hairstyle that Georgiana herself made popular and was then caricatured. This is one of the caricatures, and actually people have pointed out that there's a ducal coronet on this carriage. So we think it probably is directly caricaturing Georgiana herself. Here is an earlier example. Two more aristocratic young women, Elizabeth, here 20, and her sister Henrietta, who's 13. Yet again, you're in a rural setting, leaning on something that could be a sort of classical plinth here. And again, just this very much a sort of not really sort of full garment. It's very much drapery. It's tied with a ribbon under the bust and over the shoulder. And because it's of this idea of a classical robe, actually you're able to get away with quite a lot of shoulder hair, which of course would have been very risque if you're wearing this out and about, but she doesn't have any jewelry on. She's not sort of, she's not being sort of seen as sort of a victim to luxury and to frivolity. Instead, she's in the guise of a sort of classical virtue. Right, so it's the classical illusion is creating these sort of classical virtues of sort of perfect womanhood, perfect young womanhood. This is Mary, Duchess of Gloucester, and again you've got the classical robes, the pastoral setting, and yet again the modern hairstyle. This time we also have an Eastern influence, so the gown sort of resembles an Ottoman wrap dress. Which is sort of coming in as a sort of bedgown inside wear at the time. And she's got this sort of decorative waist sash as well. And this style in the period becomes known as a la Turque. But within Reynolds' reading of it, it still has a sort of classical antique influence. So it's a sort of hodgepodge of influences from different parts of history and from different parts of the world to create something that is timeless, rather than picking out something specific. And here we have Hester Thrale and her daughter Hester Maria, known as Queenie. Again, the classical influence, but also the sash a la Turque, and we know exactly when this was painted. Again, we just need to look at the hairstyle. And I mentioned before about the Streatham Worthies portraits. So Hester Thrale and her husband Henry had sort of done an extension to Streatham Park where they created this library. Johnson had a guest room upstairs, and Reynolds was commissioned to paint these sort of their friends and important people of the time to hang above the bookshelves in the library. And she was a great wit and a great poet, and she wrote anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson, which is sort of a competitor to Boswell. We also have her diary, the Thraliana, which includes passages on all of the portraits that Reynolds painted of the Streatham Worthies, and it's really fun to read. But there is, interestingly, a sort of downside to this timelessness, because she really didn't like this portrait. She thought that it really didn't capture her own likeness or her own sensibility. And she writes about this piece, she says, "In features so placid, so smooth, so serene, what trace of the wit or the Welsh woman seen? Of the temper sarcastic, the flattering tongue, the sentiment right, with occasion still wrong? What trace of the tender, the rough, the refined, the soul in which all contrarieties joined?" So what we have here then is a sort of counter-argument to Reynolds' timeless fashion. If the portraitist is to depict all of his sitters in matching pastoral settings, in matching robes, with matching hairstyles, then what is it saying about the individual behind it? You know, so how are we getting a sense of who they are from the setting, from the clothing? Just putting that up as a sort of comparison. This is another portrait of Hester Thrale about 10 years later. She's now Hester Piozzi, and it's by an unknown Italian artist in 1786. And she's in dress that is sort of, it's sort of fashionable dress, a little out of fashion by this point, but she's got the tight sleeves, she has ribbons, this bonnet and gloves, this sort of fantastic standing lace collar. But yeah, I don't know if we think that one or other gives us more of an insight into who she was. up to you to decide. There is a good story about the Dowager Duchess of Rutland, who had her portrait painted by Reynolds, sadly now lost, but in her diaries she complained that Reynolds made her try on 11 different dresses before just painting her in that bedgown. So it's this idea that these sort of gowns that he's putting them in are kind of just these sacks that people are wearing at home. And that's very much the point of Reynolds. It's about trying to keep the character out of the dress, instead something akin to generalized drapery. And you can very much see that in this painting here, which is a portrait of the Montague sisters, who were nicknamed the Irish Graces. And they're presented here as the classical Graces from antiquity. And the statue, or the term, is Hymen, who is the god of fertility and of wedlock. So what this painting is doing is not necessarily trying to imbue each of the sisters with their own individual characteristics or personalities. Instead, he's working for his client, Luke Gardner, who's the fiancé of Elizabeth Montague, the woman in the middle, to present the sisters as a sort of perfect paradigm of beauty and of virtue. So that's the point here. And the clothing is sort of just to evoke those thoughts and those memories of that classical past. Again, the three Graces come up here. The three Graces are in statue form here. And this is Lady Sarah Bunbury, who is another court beauty. She was a bridesmaid to Queen Charlotte when she married George III. And here she's presented as a sort of fourth Grace. And there was a term in the 18th century that was sort of saying sacrificing to the Graces, which apparently meant you were sort of full of virtue and grace, the pinnacle of sort of politeness and charm if you were sacrificing to the Graces. So what Reynolds is doing is yet again presenting her as this sort of perfect virginal classical beauty. But apparently, in actuality, Lady Sarah would much prefer to have been hunting. So again, what is kind of happening here is that actually, potentially, it's purposefully hiding her real identity to present her as somebody who is akin to the Graces. All of the portraits we've looked at so far, although they are in some kind of costume, they are still portraits of themselves. This one is a little bit different. So this is Mrs. Musters, who was a society beauty at the time. She was estranged from her husband, although they did get back together later on. But she's the toast of London and Brighton society. And here she's not just presented in a classically inspired gown. She is in a classically inspired gown, but she's actually being presented as Hebe, so as a specific goddess, the goddess of youth and beauty. She was the cupbearer to the gods. So it's a subtle difference, but quite an important one, because technically it isn't a portrait. It is a history painting of a goddess, but using a society lady as the sitter. And yet, I would suggest that sort of with this flowing gauze and sort of the flowing robes here, there's potentially something a little bit more intimate in this painting. We get, I think, a sense more about who this woman is than we potentially do in the paintings of the Montgomery sisters and of Lady Sarah Bunbury. So what is actually being worn in this period? In this, we've mainly looked at 1760s and 1770s paintings of these sort of timeless dress. Here is Reynolds painting something that's much more fashionable dress of the 1770s. You have the sort of the pink gown. Pink is sort of the utmost fashion throughout the 18th century. You've got these fantastic lace collars, lace ruffs, the net apron. She's wearing the black bands to show off the whiteness of her skin. However, this is actually her in costume. So Mrs. Abington was an actress, and here she's being presented as Prue in Congreve's Love for Love. The play is from 1695. However, the production that she is in is clearly putting them in fashionable clothing. So yes, it's fashionable dress, but because it's a costume, Reynolds is kind of getting away with breaking his own rules because he's presenting her as a sort of costumed character, as a character and not as herself. And I think you can see how much fun he's having painting her, but particularly painting her clothing. You know, he talks about it being a sort of the lesser artist to pick out whether it's silk or satin or lace. But I think here you can really see that he's sort of playing with those elements. He's enjoying doing it. Because she is also in character, she gets away with being a little bit more seductive as well, so leaning on the back of the chair and the fingers to the lips. And so we'll do a little bit of dress history now, for the potted dress history, but it'll just sort of be some bullet points. So for most of the 17th and 18th century, France is very much the sort of leading force in fashion across Europe. They're leading the way. Here is Madame de Pompadour, who is emblematic of that consolidation of power around Versailles, around the court. The dress of the court, the pastimes of the court are very much around pleasing the eye of the king. It's very much sort of, it's frills, it's frippery, it's ribbons, it's adornment, it's decorative. It's also inside, right? So there's something about this being inside these sort of gilded mirrors, inside the court of Versailles. And it's obviously very beautiful, and it has this, it sort of has this emanating effect throughout Europe because everybody is trying to copy the French. However, something is beginning to happen in the second half of the 18th century in Britain. And here will be potentially a familiar Gainsborough painting. Gainsborough much more interested in clothing than Reynolds is. And I want to include this because it really symbolises a shift that's happening in British fashion in the 18th century. So ever since the Civil War in the 1660s, society in England is really shifting. Whereas in France, court culture is being sort of really consolidated around Versailles and around the court, the English aristocracy are actually starting to move away from London, right? Lots of them give up their London townhouses, they're moving to the countryside, and they're focusing their attention there, on the countryside and on their estates. So there's this real interest in farming, in agriculture, in horticulture, and also in country sports, so in hunting and shooting. And dress really follows suit. So outfits that have previously just been worn by working men and women, often outside, begin to creep into fashionable and aristocratic wardrobes. So the frock coat, which is the main example of this, which was originally worn by coach drivers and has this big collar, big sleeves, to keep coach drivers warm, replaces the dress coat. And British wool replaces French silk. And there's this real drive at this point to try and promote British industry over foreign ones, particularly over French imports. Often Britain and war together during this period. And it's also the time that Britain is establishing its own empire and their own sense of nationhood. So this is a period where the British and fashion are really moving apart. So bear that in mind. Here we have the great 18th century actress, Sarah Siddons. Again, she's in costume. She's in costume as the tragic muse. And she's wearing a costume that is specific to the character. So again, like we were talking about with Mrs. Abington as Prue, it's sort of an actress in the costume of someone she's depicting. And again, you can see the classical influences, but I think by the 1780s, you're seeing a lot more interest in dress. So we've got the classical influences, you've got the a la Turk inspiration, but you also have a sort of medieval sense. You can tell that this sort of piece over her knees is velvet. We had these adornments as well. So there's a bit more going on with Reynolds and dress by the 1780s. And the reason I really wanted to put this one up is because Gainsborough paints this portrait the same year of also Sarah Siddon. And this is the height of fashion. So this is often used by dress historians to show where fashion is going in the 1780s. So you have this striped dress, this blue and white striped dress, it's wrap around, tied at the waist. She's wearing this great black beaver hat trimmed with ribbons and ostrich. Which do we prefer? If either. To look at. Okay, how about a different question? Which one do you think potentially captures her more? Yeah?
No, the second one.
The one in blue? Captures her more? I love the Gainsborough, and I think, sorry? The blue and white. Well, so my thing is I love the Gainsborough, and I think the fashion is stunning. Sarah Siddons was such a thespian. She spends her whole life on stage, and she's very much the sort of dramatic figure. So for me, I think the sort of like that idea of sort of the actress in her comes out much more clearly in the Reynolds, but it's sort of, you know, up to everyone's sort of personal taste there. But yes, so these are the two painted at the same time, and it's sort of showing a bit of differences in how both Reynolds and Gainsborough are looking at dress. But what I think is really interesting here is that this piece of fashionable dress, this sort of wraparound gown, remember we talked about the a la Turk style that came from bedgowns. So this too is actually derived from the Ottoman gowns that had previously been worn at home as bedgowns, and it's now coming into fashionable dress. Remember the Dowager Duchess talking about the bedgown. So it's an example of the timeless fashion that Reynolds is promoting, sort of turning into dress that is now worn as fashionable wear. So this is painted a couple of years later. This is Angelica Kauffman, who is another founding member of the Royal Academy. And this is Lady Elizabeth Foster. Lady Elizabeth Foster is Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire's husband's mistress. And here she is. She's in this pastoral setting, but she is in the fashion of 1786. And again, there are two things to note here. One is this sort of emergence of this sort of simple gown that we were talking about, you know, that move away from the fripperies of the French to a more English, simplified idea of dress. And it's something that the philosopher Rousseau is really into. He's talking about the back to nature. He's talking about getting in touch with the land. He really celebrates English approach to this and English dress. So this is sort of an emblematic of that. But I think what it's also doing is showing that these new simple gowns have a lot in common with the kind of classical robes that Reynolds is painting the previous decade. This is one of Reynolds's, and this is, again, he's painting her in fashionable dress, but again, it's sort of fine because she's in character. So this is Mary Robinson, who's one of the Prince of Wales's lovers. But again, even though she's in fashionable dress, I think there is a sort of vagueness to the dress that Reynolds sort of promotes. So by the 1780s, Reynolds paints Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, again. However, here she is in actual dress, and specifically mourning dress for her father, who's recently passed away. But this is a piece of blatant propaganda. She has recently been mired in scandal for campaigning for Charles James Fox, the Whig politician, and she's been caricatured mercilessly. So this is very much about presenting her as a doting mother and also daughter to her recently deceased father. And although it's mourning dress, it's still very fashionable. And again, I think we see this sort of British sensibility of simplicity. You know, compare this to the fripperies of Missing Abington's gown about 13 years earlier. So by the 1780s, Reynolds has slightly changed his tune on depicting fashionable dress rather than a sort of timeless piece. But I think part of that is because that fashionable dress has sort of merged together towards the same point in that it's fundamentally simpler. So it becomes much more palatable to him to actually be depicting it. And this English fashion, obviously Rousseau is promoting it, and actually it goes across to France. So the French are really picking up on this English idea for simplicity. So this is the Vigie Lebrun, Marie Antoinette in her chemise gown. It's these ideas that are coming across from England. It's sort of tying in, of course, to Republican values and sensibilities in the lead up to the revolution over there. So we can see this sort of Anglomania, as it was called, going over to France. For the last... Oh, okay, we're running out of time. I'll do very quickly talk about some men. Just going to include, I've got a whole another lecture about Reynolds and naval portraits as a good sort of Devonshire lad. He has a really interesting connection to the Royal Navy. But the reason I wanted to include these two of Augustus Keppel, who was one of Reynolds' early patrons, is because even when you're thinking about male portraits, you can still think, he is still thinking about timeless fashion, because uniforms, although in practice this isn't always the case, but in theory, uniforms are sort of timeless fashions, right? They don't change so much. So just to end, I'm going to have a talk about a few of the Streatham-worthy portraits. We're just going to pick out 3 to show a bit of a shift in this period of dress in menswear. And this painting is of Edmund Sandys. And actually I saw this 2 days ago because it just went on sale yesterday at Christie's in their big Sandys sale. They had a big Sandys estate sale. And this was on estimate between £200,000 and £300,000, and it sold for £352,800 yesterday. And this was the first of the Streatham-worthy portraits to be hung in Streatham Park, and it's the first one that Hester Thrale describes in her writing. And here he is in this sort of pink and green velvet coat, jacket and waistcoat, matching jacket and waistcoat, lace collar and sleeves. Notice that there is sort of lace at the collar, but no actual collar on the jacket here, which is important. But it's sort of this. It's some version of this has basically been popular throughout the 18th century. 1666, a really big year for dress historians because it was the year that the three-piece suit was invented. And some form of that sort of goes up through into the 18th century, and he'll have had matching breeches, although you can't see them, in this fabric. And it's very decorative, it's sort of very elegant, and he's got this wig on. This is another portrait. This one is by the American Benjamin West. Also in the sale yesterday, it went for £10,080, so much more affordable for the other portrait of Sandys. But again, it's the same kind of thing. You've got a sense that Sandys likes to dress in similar ways. However, here we have a separate portrait. This is of Arthur Murphy. And this might seem like a really small thing, but it's huge. He has a collar on his coat. So this is inspired by those, by the frock coat, which is now becoming popular, which has been that thing that's come in from the coachman so they can sort of keep warm, and is now becoming fashionable dress. Another one by Murphy. This one's by Nathaniel Dance, another Royal Academician. And again, you can see it's in a sort of much less decorative style. It's much more rough and ready. There's much less silk at the collars. There's a bit here, but not very much. So again, this is the shift in male dress that's happening at the time, again, towards this idea of English simplicity. There's a great quote from an American visiting London in the 1770s, and he's shocked by how casually everyone's dressed. So he goes to the House of Lords, and he says that Lord Effingham has the appearance, both in person and dress, of a common country farmer. A great coat with brass buttons, frock fashion, his hair short, straight, and to appearance uncombed, his face rough, vulgar, and brown, as also his hands. So it's this idea of the sort of moving away from the French fineries, but into something much more British and rough and ready. And then just sort of to end is on, of course, the portrait of Dr. Johnson himself. And again, he's in this sort of loose-fitting clothes. So this is moving towards this idea. And again, this is the Streatham portrait, and another one by Reynolds is an engraving done of him. And so in the Streatham-worthy paintings, Reynolds is very much sort of trying to depict them as they are. So his self-portrait is him cupping his ear because he was a bit deaf. Here he's showing Johnson really squinting at the book, and it's the famous quote where Johnson says that he may paint himself as deaf, but I will not be blinking Sam. But what is really interesting is it's sort of this Anglomania that I discussed earlier. It does go across to France. However, the French really sort of Frenchify it, and they smarten it up, and they turn it into something that looks much more like this. It's much more fitted, it's much more elegant, and actually, ironically, it's this style, the French version of the English country dress, that then becomes popular across Europe and actually finds its way back across to England. So the English are sort of taking the French versions of their own country styles, and that's what then becomes the fashionable dress of the sort of 1790s and into the early 19th century. England's sort of place as the leader in fashion is rather short-lived, I'm afraid. But I would suggest that there are obviously lots of other factors into the sort of changing styles. However, I think that there is something to be said and probably not through any intention of his own, for this idea of Reynolds's pursuit of a timeless fashion in his portraiture does help to usher in a new way of dressing that sort of takes off across Europe and North America. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Will. That was absolute fascinating tour de force through the 18th century dress, culture, attitudes as depicted in art. It was wonderful and fantastic to have the comparisons as well. I'd like to open the floor to questions. We have any?
Yeah, I'm interested in whether you think there was a sort of tension between the English view of this classical dress as they saw it, and by the time it got to France, because that Marie Antoinette painting called it Scandal, didn't it? They saw it as
Yes.
a chemise.
Exactly that. Exactly.
Difficulty. I mean, so what was going on there?
Well, so I think what is really interesting about this one is that it is very much a chemise that she was then wearing, which is part of the problem with the sort of scandal. Whereas the robes that they are depicted in are so far removed from what people are wearing that you can very much think of it as a sort of classical inspired costume that you're not necessarily. So does that make sense in terms of the differentiation between the two?
So if you'd taken a bit of the lace, if Elizabeth had taken some of the lace off.
Take the lace off, maybe like throw something over her shoulder. There's a fantastic, like, so, you know, the 18th century is, particularly in England, but in France also, love dressing up, and it's the age of the masquerade. And at Ranelagh Gardens, which were sort of alternative to the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, they start doing these masquerades that anybody can buy tickets to, and it's sort of, for the first time, you can actually buy a ticket to a masquerade, and actually lots of the aristocracy and lots of the celebrities at the time go along, so you can sort of have the opportunity to rub shoulders. And there's this great story of the Duchess of Rutland, Elizabeth Chudley is her name, and she was a sort of great scandal mongerer of the 18th century, and she turns up at this masquerade as Iphigenia, the sort of Agamemnon's daughter, about to be sacrificed, and she's basically in something that is sort of very revealing, but because of course it causes sensation, but because it's a costume, there's this sort of fine line around what is acceptable and what is not. Whereas this is very much not a costume. This is her. And also you've got her in a sort of a straw hat. It's very much her embodying this, and this is her new clothing. So I think there is a real frisson of a sort of scandal there.
Hi.
How often did fashion change? I mean, if you had aspirations to be really fashionable, how often would you have to get new clothes?
Yeah, really good question. So your dresses are very expensive. So the expectation that you're changing your entire wardrobe on the regular is like, that doesn't happen. However, there are so many adaptabilities, right? So there are so many things that you can change in your existing gown. So you can change your lace. So for example, if you go to Mrs. Abington here, or even Madame Pompadour. So all of this can come off. So it might be that one day that your front is, like, one year the fashion is for ribbons down here, the next it might be for laces, and it's different types of lace as well. So all of those things are very sort of, and even the decorations on the skirt, this can all change. So there's a lot of sort of ways that you can do it, or you can just amend it, so you can sort of hike up your skirt. There are lots of different ways that you can do it without having to buy a whole new gown. But those fashions do change pretty quickly in terms of what, like, even the hairstyles. So the hairstyle of the Georgiana is basically, that's kind of only around for a year and a half. And actually you can see paintings in 1778 or 1779 with people with it, but they're already out of fashion. Does that answer your question? Hi.
Who bought the photo? Who bought the picture?
Which one?
The one that was 300,000.
Don't know. Sorry.
They don't. Some private clips.
Yeah. So the sale was yesterday.
Yeah. So we don't. It wasn't. You didn't buy it, as in the academy.
We didn't. And it's just a park.
Do you know, just following on from that, do you know how it got from
Streatham House to the Sanders estate?
It'll be on the Christie's website. So the provenance will be there. I'm assuming so Hester Thrale sold all of the Streatham Worthies portraits except Arthur Murphy. So Henry Thrale died, and she was his widow, and she sort of carried on at Streatham Park for a while. And then in 1816, I think, bankruptcy meant that she had to sell all of the Streatham Worthy paintings at one, and all of the figures had died by that point. And again, the sort of we have the sale figures for those, so we can sort of judge the well-knownness of each of them by how much they went for. Johnson was top. Reynolds, I think, was fourth. Hester Thrale was very disappointed that hers didn't go for very much. And she sort of said that it should have got for more, even just as an antique piece. So yeah, I don't know if then the Sandys bought it then, or if they would have bought it back at a later date.
Gosh, well, I have a number of questions. Let's see which would be the most interesting. Yes, them all. I'm interested in the aesthetic that Reynolds is portraying in his work, but also very much the principles theoretically, and to what degree that influenced successive generations of artists, either by imitation or by rejection.
Yeah, good question. It's so, the discourses themselves have been in print continually since then, and he had a lot of followers. He was such a big character around the Royal Academy that sort of legacy very much stays on, and I think you see it in a lot of those early 19th century artists. But of course, sort of famously we've gone into the 19th century, the Pre-Raphaelites, for example, really deride his sort of academic style. He becomes a sloshuer, and it's the idea that sort of this very academic, very paint by numbers. You have to do X, Y, and Z for a successful painting, is all rejected and becomes very unfashionable. And that's sort of percolating through the 19th century, and there is a sort of real rejection of this sort of quite autocratic way in that you should be doing these paintings. And then I think he sort of refines his footing in the sort of 20th and 21st century, and as we can see from the sale figures, is now again someone very popular.
So again, can I follow up on that? I mean, there must be a fascinating study of the history of art and how presenting clothing, and presenting detail in clothing particularly, in two dimensions. Because we look at, I know I've looked at paintings, and I think I work out from the painting what the costume is.
Sure.
And you've just shown very successfully that actually that's a flawed approach in certain cases. So a whole study of what art does with costume over the period would be fascinating.
It would, absolutely. And just to follow up on that, I wonder what's your perspective on period dramas now and the historical research that goes into the costumes of them to depict the day? Are they absurd to you, or do they quite fun? Or
I think sticklers for. I mean, look, I understand the viewpoint of wanting historical accuracy in period dramas. However, I think that as historians, any period that is looking at history is through a contemporary prism, through our own eyes. And that can be in writing, in history. If you're looking at a historian writing about Reynolds, even from the 1990s, you have to take into account that they are writing in a different period. So each bit of history has these different layers, these different viewpoints, these different ways of looking at it. Our history of Reynolds is very different to the pre-Raphaelite history of Reynolds. So I think that any period drama that is putting on an 18th century piece is doing so through our current lens, a contemporary lens. So by trying to take that away, well, I think you can't take it away. You can try and take it away as much as possible, and I think that's a very admirable task. But I think by trying to ignore the fact that there are contemporary interpretations, I think that's a shame. And I think there's such wonderful ways that you can evoke the 18th century by using contemporary, Bridgerton, contemporary music, or sort of slightly anachronistic fashions. I think knowing when things are a bit anachronistic is probably quite useful. And I think oftentimes the really great costume historians who sort of go off kilter usually have a fantastic understanding of historical dress first. So you have this really, it's like that sort of thing that quite a lot of people say about contemporary artists. It's sort of like if they're doing, Tracy Emin, she can do her bed, but have you seen her drawing? She can really draw. Right, so it's sort of that sort of excuses. I think the same kind of thing with costume historians. They're like, oh no, but they do really know their stuff as well. And then once you've got that grounding, you can sort of play around.
Wonderful. Can I just clarify 2 points? With the Frenchified George. Was it Marie Antoinette who created the chemise, and then the Duchess of Devonshire brought it back here, or because she Frenchified the English style?
Yeah.
And the other thing is you say the coachman's collar coat. Was it also the riding habit, the riding coat? And because they couldn't sit down on it, the French cut it here with the tails at the back so they could sit down. Is that the Frenchified?
Well, so the chemise gown is still up for debate. So lots of people, different dress historians say different things. It's Georgiana, as you say, was great friends with Marie Antoinette, and so the chemise gown is argued as to who was first wearing it, or indeed whether it was other candidates for bringing it in. Are Madame Tallien, who was a sort of society salon hostess in Paris at the time, did she first wear the chemise gown? Or Emma Hamilton, who is living in Naples at the time and doing these attitudes, and her attitudes were a classically inspired gown that she would then sort of go to dinner afterwards. So again, where the sort of where it starts is up for debate, but I think sort of slightly, and again, it's slightly a moot point. So where are these inspirations coming from? And it's sort of, I think that there is this idea of we're obviously in height of neoclassical period. So it's sort of up for discussion still as to who created it. And I think is the thing of what's interesting about lots of these styles in the 18th century is the sort of move from inside wear or bed wear into being worn on a public setting. So that sort of Ottoman gown style starts off, and lots of the things that Reynolds is painting are start off as sort of very much sort of bed gowns or outfits to be worn at home, at your levee, where you're sort of having, you are still hosting, but you're not going outside. So again, that becomes the sort of point where things change into fashionable dress because you're then being outside. Your point on, so yes, certainly there is a lot of influences of military wear coming into popular dress, and again that's partly because of there is just so much war during the 18th century, and actually there is also a real concerted effort, I think probably both in England and in France, to redeem the reputation of its officers, particularly in the Navy. So the Navy has a real reputational problem because it's still this time of press gangs. It's sort of very quite debaucherous. I mean, so the British Army office, the army uniform is brought in the 1640s for both officers and for soldiers. The Royal Navy doesn't have a uniform until 1745 or 1755, I think, and then it's only for the officers. And again, this is an active way of trying to get the Royal Navy to be. They've had a few great successes, but it's really trying to redeem it, and it's a huge success. And my chat about Reynolds in the Navy, is that Reynolds has a huge part to play in that, because it's a lot of his naval portraits are these sort of great heroes that are based on, again, heroes of ancient Rome and ancient Greece as well. So yes, there is a lot of influences of military wear that's coming into it, and again, it also comes into female wear as well during the Napoleonic Wars later on. Was that? Yeah. Okay, great.
Fantastic. Gosh, so knowledgeable. Was there one final question that you wanted to ask?
I was going to say. Oh, I think. I was thinking, a lot of the pieces in Reynolds are sort of, in some ways, bad portraits.
Sure.
Because they are misrepresenting both the period and the person. So the person is not portrayed as who they are. And the idea of not having them in their, dress that they would normally wear, it's totally misrepresenting the whole thing. I mean, if you wanted to do something that was timeless, then why not just stick with the pure drapery, and then have something to represent the person?
Well, I suppose.
As opposed to just some pastoral piece. If someone is a particular writer or whatever they are, something that represents that is them.
Which is what, with the Stretton Worthies, it's very much what Reynolds does, and he gives each of his people a sort of, as you say, one of those indicators. And I think there is very much a gendered thing here, because what is the a bad portrait? What is the outcome that the sitters and the artists want? And actually, at this point, the outcome is that they want a portrait by Reynolds to hang on their walls to make them look beautiful. So in that respect, they do what they set out to do. I think.
The sitters not have any say in what was being done?
So they. If you read diaries of people who sat for Reynolds, not a huge amount, particularly later on. With something like, I think, the second Georgiana one, they have a very good working relationship, so I think this is probably something that is quite collaborative in terms of the outfit here. But to your point, I think it is really interesting so you look at these all of these women who are, as you say, portrayed very similarly. I think what is a really good comparison is to look at the portraits by Angelica Kauffman of her female friends, because what she does is she takes this idea of the muse, the classical inspirer of creativity, and she paints her friends who are very talented women, so they're musicians or they're poets, and she presents them as sort of the corresponding muse. So these are not only women who are inspiring and inspirers, but they are inspired to do by themselves. So they are both active in their creation, and so you've got this sort of muse trope that can be sort of throughout art history by male artists or female sitters, whereas Kaufman is kind of turning that on its head in really interesting ways, where they are both inspiring themselves, but they are then also being the creator and being the artist.
Fascinating. Gosh, well, honestly, Will, thank you. That was very educational and visually stunning, and we're indebted to you for your time today. Thank you so much. Will you join me in thanking you?